Perfect. Thanks, Jen. And thanks to your team with Walrus for having me. Thanks to everyone for joining. As Jen mentioned, I'm Pascal Chan, and I'm the Vice President, Strategic Policy and Supply Chains at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm actually in Toronto at Walrus HQ, so I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples that I'm speaking to you from. For those of you who are listening who aren't really familiar with the Canadian Chamber, we're Canada's largest and most activated business network. Our membership is comprised of over 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade, small and large, from every corner of the country. Altogether, that rolls up into more than 200,000 businesses of all sizes from all sectors of the economy from coast to coast to coast. What I can tell you about the trade war kicked off by the Trump administration is that businesses are very concerned and they're dealing with a constant state of uncertainty due to the slew of announcements that seemingly come every few days that I'm sure all of you have been following. So, as far as Canada, according to the World Bank, two-thirds of our GDP is dependent on trade. And when you look at that Canadian American relationship, you're talking about $3.6 billion in cross-border trade every single day. And that's built on the fluid movement of goods that maximizes efficiencies to offer quality products at the best price point for consumers on both sides of the border. Now, our business data lab did an analysis of Stats Canada's Canadian survey on business condition, and they show in the first quarter of 2025 that business optimism just continues to erode. And that's notable because we're seeing that among exporters. And I just talked about the value of trade. And for years, goods exporters have been among the most optimistic businesses in Canada. Now that advantage has disappeared. They're contending with heightened trade policy uncertainty due to these tariffs, conditions of weakening demand, and renewed supply chain disruption. And on that, supply chain challenges are reemerging. We saw in that data as a top business obstacle again, not just for exporters, but sort of across industries. And many of these concerns trace back to transportation bottlenecks that we've seen over the past couple of years, triggered by labor disputes and other events across trade enabling infrastructure. So, among Canadian businesses facing supply chain challenges, half are anticipating a further deterioration, which is a 21% quarterly increase, marking the largest surge in years. So, basically, what we saw is nearly 130,000 businesses say that they were directly affected by some of these labor disruptions at transportation and logistics providers. We've seen other things like extreme weather events, the COVID-19 pandemic, other geopolitical events happening overseas, like Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Houthi rebel attacks on merchant vessels in the Red Sea, a historic drought in the Panama Canal, and the U.S. also had to contend with an Eastern Gulf Coast port strike last year. All of these things have implications for Canada due to globalization and our integrated supply chains, especially with the U.S. And when all things are working as they should, everybody benefits. Unfortunately, what we've seen from the Trump administration has caused a considerable amount of chaos. There's been this constant back and forth that's done nothing but disrupt the supply chains that have fueled North American prosperity for decades. And more recently, with the announcement of retaliatory tariffs, they've upended global supply chains as the rest of the world is forced to react. And that lack of predictability means businesses aren't able to plan ahead. And when they can't plan ahead, they're just not in a position to make the kinds of smart investments that enable them to grow and create jobs. Anybody who's really looked at the stock market over the past couple of months can see that state of constant fluctuation. And that's a very clear signal. The market doesn't like tariffs, it likes stability. So at the Canadian Chamber, we've been focused on providing stakeholders, DC public policy leaders, and decision makers with the data that they need to understand the damaging impacts of tariffs. Our business data lab modeled the impacts of 25% tariffs, what that would have on Canadians and Americans, and it showed obviously an impact per average Canadian of about $1,900, but for Americans, $1,300 US. We launched tools like the Canada-US Trade Tracker, which demonstrated how provinces and states would be impacted, as well as data on which cities in both countries would be most impacted due to their dependence on Canada-US trade, which sheds light on some of those regional impacts. And that serves as a foundation for elected officials in the US in critical battlegrounds for Republicans to ratchet up some of the pressure on the Trump administration. And obviously, when we're looking at the impact of what specific supply chains, I think that's pretty much in there when we look at those reciprocal tariffs and how Canada's reacted to that by saying, obviously, the auto sector is going to require special handling. We've seen lower tariff rates for energy and potash. A lot of these things are kind of singled out, as well as health products, food packaging, also national security. So things that are sort of critical to Canadians' lives every day. And speaking of Canada as a country, we're really at this moment of national importance. we need to be united and we need to focus on our national interests. So we're well overdue when it comes to getting our house in order, and that means getting the job done on internal trade, expanding our trade relationships, as well as making sure that our regulatory approach is conducive to attracting capital and making Canada as competitive as possible in the global economy. So protecting our economic security, building resilience really has to be the priority, and that means diversifying our economy so that we're not solely dependent on the United States. Business leaders are going to be gathering in Ottawa in just a couple of weeks for the B7 summit, and the theme for 2025 is economic security and resilience, which is more relevant than ever given the current context. So I'll just leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.